Coming up, more on the Tribal Playbook and its primary season for the midterms. And meet an Oglala Lakota woman who's searching for truth and healing. I'm Mark Trahant. Aaliyah Chavez is away. Join us for those interviews plus headlines from the ICT Newscast.
Arizona State University welcomes 3,500 Indigenous students from Arizona and across the nation. It serves one of the largest populations of Indigenous students among U.S. colleges and universities. We created a sense of place for tribal nations to create futures of their own making through community outreach and research, taught by world-class Indigenous faculty where they see a reflection of themselves and their experiences. Find community at ASU.
This is the ICT Newscast with Aaliyah Chavez.
Thank you for joining us. We begin in the far north, where Indigenous leaders in Canada are hoping the Pope will add more stops on his tour of First Nation communities. The trip is part of an in-person apology tour for the abuses suffered by First Nations children at the hands of the Catholic Church. Ken Young, a former regional chief of the Assembly of First Nations, asked about a visit to the site of Canada's largest industrial residential school. But last week, Canadian bishops said the pontiff won't add more places as requested to his trip. Pope Francis, who has been using a wheelchair because of a bad knee, will head to Canada on July 24th for 5 days. His visit will include stops in Alberta, Quebec, and Iqaluit, a small town in the far north. Pressure for a papal apology increased when the apparent remains of over 200 children were detected buried in unmarked graves in Kamloops, British Columbia. There are also unidentified remains in unmarked graves at other Indigenous residential schools across the country. Pope Francis will leave Canada on July 29th. Wilma Mankiller is known for a lot of things. The first woman elected as principal chief of the Cherokee Nation, a Presidential Medal of Freedom honoree, and now a poet. Publisher Greg Shaw and poem chaser Francis McHugh sorted through the former leader's archives and a group of boxes stored in a barn in Ada County, Oklahoma. They found hidden treasures, more than 20 poems that Mankiller wrote that had been forgotten.
You know, that's what really comes through in the poetry, I think, is the kindness and the love that I remember and can still hear in that voice. The poems can be funny in places. She had a very dry wit. They can bring you to tears in places. They can outrage you in places. And I think that's who she was.
The book titled Mankiller Poems is being released today on June 6th. And today the U.S. Mint will also release the new quarter carrying Wilma Mankiller's likeness. A Canadian cartoon series called Little Glooscap and the Legends of Turtle Island is being recorded in Wolastoqey, English and French. The series follows the adventures of Glooscap, a young man who, according to retellings, will one day become a great hero and warrior for his people. APTN's Angel Moore has the story.
Oh, need up, Guabit, his get that Paulie.
Memaskin, his Paulo need up, and Nil Dapu A.
Oh, need up, leader Hazipan Jalpinupsk. What?
That is Little Glooscap, speaking Wolastoqey. He's the main character of the cartoon series called Little Glooscap and the Legends of Turtle Island, and he's played by multimedia artist Natalie Sapier of the Tobic First Nation. And it's the first time an animated series has been voiced in Wolastoqey.
Every part of your spirit is awake, and then you start seeing your language everywhere. So I'm really excited to see this show be airing because I miss it.
The series follows the adventures of Glooscap as a boy. According to legend, he's said to have created landscapes and animals. Tara Audibert conceived the series and wrote, produced, and directed all of the episodes. Her aim is to preserve her language by teaching the youth.
I grew up on Sesame Street, and I probably know more Spanish than I do Wolastoqey. So just from watching that. So I think it's important that, the culture is within our entertainment streaming, especially for kids.
Grandmother Mimi Mewen is voiced by Imelda Purley. She's fluent in Wolastoqey and ensured the script was in the traditional language.
So what this is doing in the language, it's showcasing identity to be safe, identity to be shared, identity to be proud of, identity to be, celebrating.
Sapir says Little Glooscap was a challenge.
But you put them into a character. You're putting an action to it. And where I'm very new with telling stories this way, I was like, wow. So I cleared my schedule for like 3 months to focus on Little Glooscap. And it was such an amazing experience.
The 13 episodes of Little Glooscap and the Legends of Turtle Island begins airing on APTN in English, French, and Wolastoqey. Angel Moore, APTN National News, Jabuktuk, known as Halifax.
And those are the headlines for the ICT Newscast. Coming up, navigating funding for tribes is complicated, but Brian Newland has a plan. ICT political correspondent reports on the midterm primaries. But first, Tashina Banks-Rama talks about her Bush Fellowship. Stay with us. The Bush Foundation awards fellowships to individuals living in Minnesota and the Dakotas. Tashina Banks-Rama will use her award to advance a Lakota worldview. As Executive Vice President of Red Cloud Indian School, she oversees a Truth and Healing initiative to address the generational harm caused by U.S. boarding school policies. Welcome, Tashina.
Thank you, Mark. Glad to be here.
So maybe describe the scope of your fellowship to start.
Okay. Yeah, well, I have 6 areas of growth I'm going to be focusing on over 2 years. Mine is what Bush Fellowship calls a self-design plan. So I will be focusing on some areas that I'm already working on. The first is to continue my journey in being a second language learner. And that is to be conversationally fluent in Lakota. I've been enrolled in a program for 3 years where I take classes an hour, 5 nights a week. So I will continue with that journey. Another is to focus, doing some really focused study on the Lakota worldview. A lot of the work that I do here and in the community, it really to be more fluent and to have a better understanding of our own worldview and our origin stories helps me to create and frame a lot of where we are, our community, our journey, where we are in the world, using the context of our origin stories. So I know very little, so I need to, I'm going to spend time learning more about that. Another area is just really more storytelling and writing workshops for myself, so that as I continue on this journey of meeting with community members, the promoting Lakota leadership, all of those different things that I'm involved with, that I can continue to retell those stories in a way that is appropriate, ethical, and but amplifying those voices in the best way that I can. And then the biggest area probably, which sort of is I think my focus in work mostly, is to really bring to light the truth and healing work that is happening here at Red Cloud School, with the history of Red Cloud being a boarding school. That is something that is really core to my beliefs in my life. The school that we are today is beautiful, a thriving school that promotes Lakota songs, language, and all of our traditions, being taught by Lakota teachers and spiritual advisors. but that's who we are today. That's not always who we've been. So bringing to light that shameful history of being a boarding school is really a core to a lot of the work that I do in my day-to-day life. And then the other two areas are really focusing on self-care and how to find a balance doing all of those things so that I can continue to be, a strong mother, rested wife, and keep energy levels high so I can keep doing the work that we're doing here.
That's fascinating. A couple of things I do want to follow up on. You mentioned the history of Red Cloud, and I think it is an extraordinary history. I also know that Red Cloud probably has more Gates Millennial Scholars than almost any school of its kind anywhere in the world. How do you reconcile this journey that Red Cloud is going through?
You mean reconcile it in a way where...
With the structure and the changing times and getting out of the colonial system into something new.
Yep. I mean, the students who go here today, who have gone through Red Cloud school system, if it's an alumni who's 80 years old or one of our youngest students today, I mean, we're Lakotas, and that's who we are. And the more that this institution continues to employ and recruit and promote Lakota leadership, the curriculum, the systems are changing from within. So that's really what's been happening here at Red Cloud over the last 20, 30 years. And so my role here at Red Cloud is just to keep that work going, keep that work moving. We have young Lakota teachers who are developing curriculums that address and bring to light and truth in our classrooms the boarding school history. So we have our own young community members who are teaching our youngest students about what the history of boarding school and specifically Red Cloud's role in that boarding school policy.
Tashina, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you, Mark, for having me.
We'll be right back. The bipartisan infrastructure law sets aside $13 billion specifically for tribes and hundreds of billions of dollars more for tribal programs. The trick now is getting the money out of the federal agencies and into the hands of tribal administrators. ICT's Shirley Snavy has more.
Navigating around a myriad of funding opportunities is daunting. A new document called the Tribal Playbook strives to guide tribes through this process. Brian Newland is the Assistant Secretary of the Interior for Indian Affairs.
We wanted to make sure that folks had a playbook, like in sports. You want to know if it's a third and goal that you've got to play in your playbook that will score you a touchdown. And that's our hope with this, that it's something that you can flip to the right page and get what you need. This is a big deal because this is the federal government listening to tribes and what we heard from tribes, which is don't make this funding hard for us to get. Don't make it difficult for us to improve our communities and meet our needs. So we worked really hard to make things just a little bit easier for Indian country. I hope tribal leaders and their staffs find it helpful and useful, and again, that this money gets out into communities quickly and makes a difference in people's lives. It's important because I know from my time as tribal leader and hearing from folks around the country during our travels that one of the most frustrating things about running a tribal government is hearing that there are federal funds available, but not knowing what they're for or how to access them. And so, the administration, all the way up to the president, prioritized this undertaking to make sure that we were making it easier for tribes to find us and really not asking folks to jump through more hoops than necessary to get at this funding, which is historic levels of funding in Indian country. And we didn't, it's most important that it gets out and gets on the ground. We didn't want to make it any more difficult than it needed to be.
Information from a number of government agencies is in the Tribal Playbook.
All of the different agencies engaged in either listening sessions or consultations when putting their spending plans together. And then, of course, we're coordinating with each other through the White House Council on Native American Affairs and other venues within the administration. But we're all doing our best to make sure that this money gets to where it's needed, which is on the ground in tribal communities.
I asked Newland what opportunities excite him the most.
For me, that's really easy. I'd have to say the climate funding, because this has been a program within the Bureau of Indian Affairs in recent years for climate adaptation and resilience. But the amount of money that the bipartisan infrastructure law has plowed into this program is a really meaningful down payment on climate adaptation for Indian country. And as many folks who watch this program know, Indian country is at the forefront of the impacts of climate change, particularly coastal communities and coastal communities in Alaska. And so this funding is going to give us a lot of tools to start to address that in a meaningful way. Our climate resilience and adaptation funding is a regular program that operates through the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And you can find that at build.gov on this playbook. And then we are also still evaluating how we're going to put most of that $216 million to use for climate relocation and adaptation. And again, coordinating with our partner agencies, because relocation of a community involves relocating schools, houses, drinking water infrastructure, power lines, heating lines in facilities, and phone and internet and health centers, you name it. So there are a lot of agencies that are going to be involved in this, and we're a piece of that with this funding.
Broadband access is an issue in Indian country.
I got a firsthand look of that on my recent trip to Alaska, where even when you go into some of these bigger communities, your internet, your bandwidth is really limited. And that makes it very difficult, where we're doing so many things online, consultations, government to government engagement. And that's something we're going to prioritize. We've been working with our friends at the Department of Commerce as they're evaluating the funding requests for broadband infrastructure. We have the piece on the ground to make sure there's permits and rights of way to get into homes in Indian country. And so we've put some policies in place, including a recent national policy memo to speed that up so that the BIA isn't a barrier to getting those funds out and to getting wires in the grounds and into people's homes.
COVID is still hitting Indian country hard.
We continue to hear of cases in tribal communities across the country. We also see it within the Department of the Interior. The Bureau of Indian Affairs and Bureau of Indian Education had disproportionately more cases than our fellow agencies within the Department of the Interior, which tracks, right, what we've seen in Indian country, that Indian country has been disproportionately impacted by COVID. So have the Indian employees in the Indian Affairs bureaus here at the Department of the Interior. And, we try to make sure that, this our staff and our team knows to take care of themselves, take precautions. We try to be flexible and caring as an employer. And then, of course, where tribal governments want our assistance, that we're connecting them with the right folks. And oftentimes that's other agencies as well, but we don't, again, I've been on the other side when you're a tribal leader and you just want some help from the federal government, and there shouldn't be a wrong door to the federal government. So sometimes if people have an IHS call or question or another agency that can help with COVID, like FEMA we try to connect tribes with them if they call us.
In Lincoln, Nebraska, Shirley Snavy, ICT News.
We're in the middle of primary elections around the country. Some of the results are already in. Joining us is ICT's political correspondent, Paulie Dennett. Welcome, Paulie.
Thank you so much for having me.
So tell us about some of the races that Indian country should be watching.
So the races that I think that Indian country should be watching is definitely Charles Graham out of North Carolina. He is headed to the general election and will be going up against an incumbent candidate. But I really think that he has a good shot in North Carolina. In this particular area, for a long time, it was represented by a Democratic candidate. And so I do think that Charles Graham has a good shot. And then the other is Mercedes Krause out of Nevada. And I feel like that is such an amazing race to watch. She's running in a district that does have Native voters. And I think that's going to make all the difference. And another one is Adam Hollier out of Michigan. And it has been so amazing to discover that race and really start watching it. And so I'm super excited to see what happens. And then the other race that I think is really, really extremely important is Sharice Davids. So Sharice is running in a area that is now leaning, thanks to the redistricting, is now a bit more conservative than it was before. And so it has been described as a toss-up district. And so Sharice Davids is going to possibly have a harder time getting reelected this time around.
I also want to ask you about, on the Republican side, the crowded primary for the U.S. Senate in Oklahoma.
Yes. So in Oklahoma, there is definitely a more crowded race in that area, and it's definitely one that folks should be watching. One of the front runner for that is Markwayne Mullin. And so it's definitely a very important race to watch, as he is the favored candidate.
Oklahoma is so interesting anyway, because you have folks who are tribal citizens, including the governor, who actually don't necessarily agree with the agenda that most tribes have in terms of sovereignty and really governance structures.
Yeah, Oklahoma is very interesting. And we see that also at the state level as well, with state legislatures who oftentimes the state of Oklahoma and the indigenous nations of Oklahoma are often at odds. It's a very interesting state.
How does it look so far for candidates running for state legislatures?
So Oklahoma actually has the largest number of indigenous candidates running for the state legislature. And I think it's incredible to see the number of indigenous candidates that do run in Oklahoma. There are, I think right now, the majority of them are Republican candidates. And I think there are only 2 Democratic indigenous candidates running in Oklahoma so far.
And the highest percentage would be Montana with 13 legislative candidate or legislators now. And again, many of them running for re-election.
Yes. So Montana, and that's actually coming up tomorrow. So their primary is happening tomorrow for Montana, South Dakota, New Mexico, and California. So there are indigenous candidates running in all 4 of those states that I will be watching tomorrow.
I also want to ask you about a tribal election coming up, and that's the Navajo Nation.
Yeah, so for the Navajo Nation, like every single year, there are a huge number of candidates who declare that they're running. I believe this year there are 15 candidates running, and a lot of talk around Boo Van Nygren, who is running. He ran in the last election as the vice presidential candidate for Joe Shirley, and also Ethel Branch is someone that folks have been talking about. And again, current president Jonathan Nez is running for re-election as well. And so that has been sort of the buzz, but we also do have former Vice President Frank Dayish, who's also running in this race as well. And so those are a few of the folks that people are talking about. And yeah.
So we only have about 30 seconds. Any surprises you expect tomorrow?
You know, I am excited to see what happens, particularly in New Mexico. So that's a race that I'm definitely going to be watching, especially with the redistricting here in New Mexico.
Paulie Dennett, thank you so much. And that's a slice of our Indigenous world. For more news, visit IndianCountryToday.com. From all of us in the newsroom, stay safe, my relatives. I'm Mark Trahan.
Sometimes you got to take a stand just because you know you can. Oh, you got to run, you got to run.